Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 88 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That is Fia. And Fia, you took a quick trip home to New York this past week.
Yes, I did. That is why I was not on the podcast last week.
So how was visiting the homeland?
It was so nice. The first thing I have to say is that the air just smells so good in New York.
It
I think
does.
I think it's like the time of year too, because it was a little cooler when I came there, and I don't know, something about just like it was giving fall. It was giving fall, and I know it's a little early, but I just wanted to believe that it was fall. And I was in New York, and it was fall, but it wasn't. Only the air smelled like that. So,
well, yeah, last week was a very sort of early fall weather. Like I think a couple nights it was down to like low 50s at night, which is kind of strange for mid-August. But I definitely appreciated it. I know Liz and our dog appreciated it. Keeping it a little cooler and less humid. It's definitely gotten way less humid over the last couple weeks. So man, it's all uphill from here.
Yeah, it was definitely nice to get a break from the Louisiana heat.
Yeah.
But
so before we get started today, we have a quick message from Mike and his progress on the Adirondack High Peaks.
Hey everybody, Mike here with another update on my 46 High Peaks in 69 Days challenge. On last Friday, I was able to do Haystack, Basin, and Saddleback Mountains, which was really awesome. A lot of really cool views. It was really difficult getting up Saddleback Mountain with the cliffs, which made it just all the more fun once we got up there. Plus the fact that I met a 4-year-old that was like 2 or 3 mountains away from finishing up her 46, which was really awesome. Great day on Friday. On Saturday, I was able to do Allen Mountain, which was kind of a challenge with the way that mountain is set up, but I was still able to get up and had a lot of fun. So I'm currently up to 35 right now. The summer is coming quickly to an end, and it's not looking too good for me finishing before school starts, but I still have 35 down. I have 3 more hikes to actually finish up, and I will make sure to keep you guys updated on when those take place, whether they are going to be in the next week, the next month, or a couple of years from now. But until then, I have 35 mountains down, and the summer is coming to an end. Thank you all for following me on this wild ride. This might be the last update, or there might be 1 or 2 more, but we'll go from there. Until then, here is Gavin and Fia.
All right, so thank you for that wonderful update, Mike. Hopefully, you can get at least close to the 46. It'll depend. I think I have no idea when school starts in New York. Like it's been
it's like
solid...
after Labor Day.
Is it? Okay.
I think so.
That sounds right. Because I think at least my school was like that Tuesday after Labor Day.
Yeah.
Or maybe that Wednesday. That sounds sort of correct. So he's got a couple more weeks. So hopefully he can get at least to 40 or so.
Right.
And
you know what? Even if you don't, Mike, like you achieved something. You did
sure.
A lot more than many other people can say. So super proud of you, buddy.
More than I've done, and I consider myself a fairly outdoorsy person. So yeah, super proud of you.
Yeah.
But yeah, so getting into a little bit of the topics for today's episode. So before we do anything else, we have some general updates about some directions that we're going with the show. So first, I've definitely noticed that since Mike has been gone, it's been harder to keep myself from getting really into the weeds on things on the script. And I'm sure Fia has noticed that too. So yes, we talked about this before we started recording, and the whole premise of the show when we started it is guy who knows things explains thing to guy who doesn't know things. And especially over the last handful of episodes, probably last, I'd say even a little bit when Mike was still on as a regular host, but that sort of premise was starting to go away. And that's the whole reason why we started the show. And so we're going to be sort of shifting gears to make it a little bit less technical And part of that is going to involve some of your help as listeners, because occasionally I don't know when I'm being too technical, because once you sort of know a thing, it's hard to think that other people don't know that thing, if that makes sense.
Right. No, I get that.
And so my assumption of people's baseline knowledge of various things is not good. So,
oh dear.
Yeah. So, I'm not going to get it perfect. Sometimes it might be a little too, untechnical, and sometimes it might be still too technical. So, giving us feedback would be greatly appreciated. The best way to do that would be our Twitter DMs are open, or commenting on the YouTube version of the podcast if you listen to it on YouTube, or you can find the link to it down in the show notes. But giving us any kind of feedback on the show would be super appreciated as we sort of try to figure out the best way to do this. Because as I told Fia in 2 episodes ago, episode 86 about primates, it kind of just felt like I was reading off a fact sheet.
Yep.
And that's not fun for me. Probably wasn't fun for Fia to listen to. And if it's not fun for the people doing it, it's definitely not fun to listen to. And that's the goal of the show, is, to be educational while also being fun. So we're going to switch some things up, and but giving us any kind of feedback that you can via all the links down in the show notes would be super appreciated. And to help with that, we're going to be announcing the following episode at the start of each episode. So next episode will be about the Permian period, specifically the end Permian mass extinction. So if you have any questions, any thoughts about it, feel free to leave those, again, in our Twitter DMs or on the YouTube version of this, or on the Twitter thread where I post the episode links on Twitter, or anywhere else you can find us. So any kind of feedback with that would be super appreciated, because I want to be as interactive as I can, both between, us, the hosts, and you all, the listeners, but also between hosts. So I'm also going to ask, Fia and Mike to come up with some baseline questions, because, again, especially with, things like geologic periods, I'm so used to them that I get, have a hard time framing it for people who have never heard the words Permian period before. So hopefully things are going to be a little bit more enjoyable for us, and hopefully more enjoyable for you all as well. But another thing that we are going to be doing is switching up the order of things that happen. So I'm going to toss it over to Fia.
Yeah, and just a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and give us feedback, like Gavin said, about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the podcast. And if you would like to be a guest, which we would really love, be sure to fill out our guest form, which can be found in the show notes. So the switch up, I'll be starting the episode with Swamp Corner. And the species that I have for you today is the Gulf toadfish, Opsanus beta. Locally, I've heard it called dogfish, oysterfish, or oyster cracker. Though
that's a fun
those
name.
are,
I like the oyster cracker, because
yes.
Does it eat oysters?
Well, this is what's like kind of controversial, is that there's 2 main toadfish that I have learned about. There's the Gulf toadfish and the oyster toadfish. And the oyster toadfish is only found like along the eastern coast, and like a little bit down at the bottom of Florida, but it's not really in the Gulf. But like everybody that I've talked to locally has called it like an oyster fish or oyster something. And the Gulf toadfish has, to my knowledge, no known, I guess, diet of like being known for eating oysters. But it could be true. It's just there's kind of a lack of knowledge with the Gulf toadfish in terms of scientific articles on them. But anyway, they're found along the lower East Coast, Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean regions. They're commonly found on rocky cuts and in oyster reefs, usually in the coast or shallow open water. The adults in the western coast of Florida usually spawn in February and March, and when they're in mating season, the nesting males will stay and protect the eggs, and they'll produce grunt calls called boat whistles. This is used as an advertisement to attract females and also to be competition among males to kind of assert their dominance in the region. And because they make noise underwater, they can be recorded with underwater recorders, which I've actually heard one, and it's super, super cool.
Which it's also just very strange. Like, fish don't tend to be the most noisy of animals.
Well, that's actually not true. There's actually a lot of fish that make sounds, and there's a whole like acoustic sound base of all of the fish that have been recorded and proven to make noises underwater. And there's actually up and coming potential methods for monitoring ecosystem health and biodiversity in underwater ecosystems because of certain fish that are able to make noises. You can maybe correlate some sort of ecosystem health condition with those organisms if you know their life history of what their salinity ranges or temperature ranges and so on.
Okay, interesting. So it's sort of like, you know, if you have like a pond behind your house or something and you hear all the frogs, and then suddenly you very notably don't hear like one frog, you're like, oh, something happened to that frog.
Right, exactly.
Sorta. Okay.
Yeah, this is a huge thing that happens in terrestrial stuff because of birds. Obviously make a lot of noise, and so a lot more research has been done on trying to monitor ecosystems in the terrestrial realm, and now there's kind of this push for that to happen with underwater ecosystems too.
Neat.
Yeah. And so
that's really cool.
Yep, that's a Gulf toadfish.
Awesome. So, transitioning to our main body of the episode, as you saw from the title, we're going to be talking about the fun world of Pandora, the planet that James Cameron's Avatar, not Avatar The Last Airbender, we don't speak of that movie, but the James Cameron movie from 2009.
Why don't we speak of that?
The live-action Avatar The Last Airbender movies is one of the few movies to have like a 0 on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, really?
It is absolutely horrible. And, well, to be fair, neither have I. But because I've seen so many things being like, this movie's horrible, it will tarnish the show. And I'm like, I love that show. That is one of my favorite shows of all time. So I'm not going to watch it just to avoid risking ruining the show.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good to know. Thank you for saving me from that.
Yeah. But regardless, not that one. So there is actually a sequel to Avatar coming out this December, 13 years later. And Avatar is the highest or second highest, depending on how you count it, grossing movie of all time. So, very popular movie.
I really hope they live up to the first movie.
Me too. I love these movies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a couple times where I'm going to be a little critical of some of the things in it. That doesn't mean I don't love this movie. I have the extended director's cut with like 45 minutes of extra footage. I love this movie. And so I'm going to be dumping on it in a couple places, but that doesn't mean I don't love this movie. So I really like this movie, not as much for the plot. The plot's okay. I had the pleasure of watching the movie Dances with Wolves, starring Kevin Costner, not too long before this movie came out. and I was like, oh, it's just Dances with Wolves in space. So if you've ever seen Dances with Wolves, that is more or less the plot. If you haven't, I recommend it. It's a pretty good movie, although you can tell that it was made in the 90s.
Yeah, I've never seen it either.
It's very good. But
it's like same plot?
More or less. But this is not an episode about Dances with Wolves. Yeah. So, like I said, a pretty good story. It's a little white saviory. But that's, a topic for another time. But I feel like that's something that needs to be at least mentioned with this kind of movie. Yeah. But the big thing that I love this movie for is all the world building that it does. And unfortunately, this movie is only like 150 minutes long. Because a lot of the world building is actually done off screen in, various books, comics, things that were published after the fact. So if I mention something and you don't remember it from the movie, don't feel bad. It might not have been in there. But some of the sources that I did use for these sort of aftermarket things, they released a survival guide to Pandora, the planet, that goes through all the biology, even a lot of the geology, which was a very surprising thing for me because most franchises tend to just ignore the geology around them.
Wow.
So that was a pleasant surprise. We're not going to go too much into it because this episode is already going to be a little long. Maybe that will be a future episode once we get a little closer to the release of the second one.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah. But there's even been scientific papers published about this movie and some of the speculative evolution. So there'll be all sorts of links. A link to the actual survival guide, because if you make an account with archive.com, you can rent it for 14 days, I think. And it's definitely worth the read, as well as a short paper and a really cool long blog post from a really well-known science communicator fully about the movie. So all the stuff will be down below if you want to read more. But very quick synopsis of the movie. The year is 2054 or 2154. Earth is basically a dumpster. There is basically no wild spaces at all left on Earth. It is basically all just giant city. And humanity has since moved on to exploring other planets, namely a moon called Pandora in the Alpha Centauri solar system, about 4.5 light years away. So, grand scheme of
real.
I don't know if the moon is real. Alpha Centauri is definitely real. That is a real solar system. I didn't look up to see how far away it actually is.
Okay.
But it's an interesting solar system in and of itself because it has 3 stars.
Well,
it has 2 sun-like stars and a dwarf star. And it's all in the same solar system. All the planets in the solar system function around those 3 stars. So it's interesting.
So how can it ever be night?
That's a wonderful question that I don't know the answer to.
Okay. Maybe they're synced up. So it's
right. I'm sure. Well, actually, no, it's space. You can't really be sure of anything with that. But
anyway.
In the movie, there is nighttime.
Yes.
But anyway, disabled Marine veteran Jake Sully gets roped into going to Pandora because his twin brother was a scientist who worked with the Avatar program, where human DNA is spliced together with DNA of a native humanoid species, and you can more or less mind link with the hybrid body and drive it around like it's your body. After being stranded with the native peoples on the planet, called the Navi, Jake basically learns that colonialism is bad and turns on the human military outfit on the planet. Long story short, the Navi win with the help of nature coming to their rescue, and most of the humans are forced off the planet. That is more or less how the first movie ends.
I really would like to admire the character building of Jake because he came a long way and then he did good.
He sure did. Yeah, it is. Like I said, it's a long movie. Even like the base movie, like I said, is 150 something minutes. So it's decently long, but it's definitely worth a watch. But presumably, you've already seen it, or will be looking up some of these animals, because this is some of the coolest like alien animals, and like especially alien ecosystem, because it's really clear that these things all work together. It's not just a bunch of cool looking things slapped together on a planet to sell toys.
Absolutely.
They actually put thought into how these animals work alongside each other with their ecosystem, which is really cool. And before we get into anything about the life on the planet, it is interesting because I would hesitate to call any of these things in the movie animals or plants.
Why?
So, animals are in the kingdom Animalia and evolved on Earth. By calling them animals, for example, that would mean that all of the animal-like things on Pandora are more closely related to Earth animals than Earth animals are to, for example, like Earth plants, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
we'll circle around to it sort of at the end of the episode, but calling life probably arose completely independently on Earth and Pandora in this movie, although like I said, we'll circle back to that because there's some interesting conversations about that. But so technically they would not be called animals or plants, because it's also the same case for the plants, but for the sake of simplicity I will call them animals and plants. But just know that technically they are not. They would be their own Pandora animals or Plant Dora or whatever scientists would call those groups of life. All right, so some basics about pretty much all of the animals on Pandora. Almost all of them have all of these features. There's a couple that don't. We'll point them out when we get there. Most of the animals have 6 limbs, which is interesting because we're so used to vertebrates having only 4, or in the case of things like snakes or whales, less. We're not used to them having more and it working.
Yeah, that is odd.
Yeah, and it's not inherently, wrong. That just as easily could have happened here. That's just not the way the evolutionary dice rolled, more or less. Right. Most of the animals breathe through a hole on the side of the neck or on the chest. They don't really have, a nose. Well, I guess a lot of them have nostrils, but they don't use it in the same way we would. Although they must still be able to pass air through their mouth because they scream a lot. There's a lot of roaring animals and stuff like that in these movies. So they must be able to do something other than like eat with their mouth. But notably, all of them have some kind of just hole in their neck that they breathe through.
Yeah. But that wouldn't be an indication that they don't have lungs or like a respiratory
I wouldn't think so. I think in a lot of I think a good number of them you can see like their chest moving up and down as they're breathing.
Right.
So it'd probably work kind of differently than our lungs, but presumably similar-ish. The atmosphere on the planet is different. It is much higher in carbon dioxide and much thicker, which comes up for physics reasons in a little bit. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I don't like physics. But let's see. So most of the animals, actually I think all of them, now I'm thinking about it, maybe one exception, but it's not one we're going to talk about because it's one of the less interesting ones, have the structure called a queue. Queue as in this like a line, or like you're waiting in a queue. That allows them to directly connect their nervous system with each other or to a number of plants on the planet. It's the thing in their braid. That is what they call it. Okay. I don't think they ever call it that in the movie, but that's what all of the stuff
Yeah.
that I read online call it.
It's like the little tentacly, or like they almost look like a root. They look like roots.
Yeah, they do. But it basically lets them connect their brain to either others of their species, other animals, or even plants, because the whole planet more or less functions as a brain, I guess. That's part of the biology that we're not going to be talking about, because I think it's a little silly. It's part of the world building that I don't really buy, but most of the rest of it's good. Most of them have multiple sets of eyes, a main primary set, and then a smaller secondary set that is used to see other wavelengths of light. Many of the animals have teeth made out of a dark black substance. They mention a couple times that the bones of all the animals have some kind of carbon fiber in them, so maybe that's what the teeth are. Most of them do not have hair, and almost all of them have some kind of bioluminescence, so they glow in the dark.
That's probably the best, like, graphical part of the movie, I think, is when it's nighttime and everything's glowing.
I know. I'm very excited to watch this movie. We just got a fancy new TV.
Ooh.
And it's not quite an OLED. We don't have OLED money. But it's still a nice TV. And I'm very much looking forward to watching this movie the next time we get the chance.
Yeah.
So that is the case for almost all of these animals that we're going to be talking about. We're only going to go through a handful of the actual animals. There's a bunch that you just see sort of in passing that there's more detail on different things online or in like the bonus stuff on the director's cut DVD. We're not going to go into too many of those. But the one that we're going to start with is the actual humanoid species, the Navi, because they break almost all of those rules that I just laid out. They have a regular nose. They don't have the neck breathing holes. They only have 4 limbs. They have hair. They don't have the secondary set of eyes. Their teeth are white. So, and it's very clear why they, sort of. They have patterns along their face and body and arms. Right. I read online that it's, granted, everything online is sort of framed as an earth scientist perspective on it. So a lot of it is phrased as, we think that it's to tell each other apart, partially.
Oh, okay.
So, and almost all of these are also given a scientific name, which can be good if the people they hired to come up with these names knew biology. So the name for the Navi is Homo pandoris. So Homo being the genus that we are in. No, that's not how it works. And to the point where I was like, is that like not allowed? Because there are rules when it comes to giving a new species a name. And generally it's frowned upon, especially the genus Homo, where it's like, that's us.
Yeah.
You don't just throw that around willy-nilly. It is doable, particularly if the groups are not closely related. For example, the genus Argus has been used a million times across several different groups of animals, a couple different groups of plants. So it's not impossible, and especially with them being an entirely different form of life, probably one of the more like okay reasons to do it. But come on, most people don't know that.
Yeah.
So I don't like the name, but that's the name they chose. If you are generally unfamiliar with the movie, number 1, go watch it. But number 2, the Navi are blue humanoids, so vaguely human-shaped, and somewhere in the ballpark of around 10 feet tall. They have blue skin that sort of varies with light blue and darker blue to give themselves sort of stripes, with bioluminescent dots all along their face, body, and arms and stuff. They have a lot of cat-like features, which was a choice.
Yeah.
They have like really pointy sort of cat-like ears and cat-like eyes, and even a sort of like cat-like tail that swishes around a lot.
Yeah.
And a couple things online kept calling the tail prehensile, and I'm like, I don't think you know what that word means. Because prehensile means you can wrap it around stuff, like a monkey tail or a chameleon tail. And we're never seen that they do that. It just sort of swishes around and knocks stuff. But anywho, unlike most of the other animals on Pandora, they only have one queue, the braid thing. They only have one of those. Most of every other animal has two, one on each side of their head. Like I said, they only have 4 limbs and don't even have any kind of, spot where it looks like another set of limbs would be. They breathe through their nose or mouth. They only have 1 pair of eyes, whitish teeth. And it is very obvious that they did all of this to make them look more like us, to make them more relatable as characters. And even James Cameron came out and said so, to the point where he was like, yeah, I gave the main female character, or the females of the species, breasts to make them more human. Because biologically, there's no reason for them to have them. We don't, obviously, it's, I think it's PG-13, but, we don't go too much into the reproductive biology of these very human-like animals. But I don't believe in anything that I read it said that they produce milk or anything like mammals do. So there's really no reason for them to have breasts, and yet they do. So thanks for that, James Cameron. Thanks for spelling that one out for us. There are a lot of really interesting cultural aspects that they have too, but I don't study culture, so we're not going to go into it. But there have been lots of things published, in actual scientific journals about the made-up culture and even the made-up language, which is also quite neat. So you could literally go down weeks worth of rabbit holes getting the lore for this movie. It's really cool.
Do you know how long this movie took to make?
I want to say 5 years, 6 years.
Wow. I guess I don't really know in reference to other movies how that is.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I want to say they finished filming in 2006. And then all the rest of it was doing all the, 3D animation work.
Yeah.
That the movie won every award for visuals that year.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's all we're going to talk about the Navi. There's, it's the most highlighted, animal in the movie. So if you want to learn more about it, there are lots of resources online, as well as the movie shows just about everything that the Navi actually do. The next one we're going to talk about is the genus Pro Lemuris. It is sort of the monkey-like animal that they see sort of when they're first walking around in the forest before Jake gets lost. They're very monkey-like, but they're weird. Their main sort of interesting feature to me is that they only sort of have 6 limbs. So their upper 2, in most of the animals, it's sort of, they have their very dedicated hind pair of limbs, and then 2 pairs of front limbs that are pretty much the same, more at the front of the body. With these ones, they're 2 pairs of front limbs. The upper arm, your humerus, where your bicep and tricep are, those 2 are fused together. So it would be like if you had another forearm coming out of each of your elbows. That's
crazy.
Interesting. That again, that sure was a choice. And I think that they did this to sort of give themselves an out. Because in a couple of the things that I read, it said that these are fairly closely related, evolutionarily, to the Navi. And they're like, this is maybe how they only have 4 limbs now. Yeah, I don't particularly buy it, but at least there is an in-world reason that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Kind of.
Right. So each of their 4 hands has 2 really long fingers on it, while the feet have actual 4 toes. And in a lot of other ways, it is sort of an intermediate. Like it does have the extra pair of eyes, but they're much smaller. The neck breathing holes are much smaller. It has a little bit of hair on the top of its head, and it also only has one Q, the link thing, the link cord. So yeah, so it's got a handful of traits in common with the Navi, which would make sense, but the mechanics of the elbow, I'm not a physicist, as I mentioned earlier, but I'm not sure if I'm buying that one.
Yeah. Seems sus.
So, yeah, it really does. Next, we're going to get into some of the actual cool ones. That one I was just putting in for evolutionary reasons, because I'm a nerd. So, the big predator guy, the Thanator, is what they call it in the movie, but the scientific name is Thanatora ferox, which is actually kind of interesting. So it's based off of the Greek word for death, is Thanatos.
Oh.
So it's pretty neat. This is the large panther-like one. The one that makes
very
Jake
scary.
Very scary. Very cool design. And so it's also weird because it's anytime you watch the movie, you have to keep in mind that because for most of the movie, the only characters we see are the Navi. And you always have to kind of keep in your mind as a frame of reference that they are roughly 10 feet tall. And so this thing is much bigger than he is. And so it's weird because you're always sort of thinking, how big is that compared to me?
Right.
Whenever I talk about, prehistoric animals or look up various things, like, okay, but how big is that? So this thing is roughly 18 feet long and 8 feet tall, and is very large and very panther-like. And because it's panther-like, of course, it is black, because for whatever reason, movies need to make every panther-like thing black, even though Black Panthers aren't really as much of a thing as the media would lead you to believe.
What do you mean?
So there's no species of Black Panther. It is similar to being albino, but the opposite. Where it's just some individuals happen to have the genetics that make them completely black instead of the normal, leopard spotted.
So it's more of a rare mutation?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, these guys, they have an interesting strip of armor along their back, and it has a really flat tail. Not quite like beaver flat, but much flatter than say a lion's tail or something, or you would think of for something that looks like a panther. This is, according to a lot of things that I read, the largest predator on the planet that isn't flying around. We'll get to those. Yeah, so, which is interesting because several of the things also said, and I'm sure this was just for media hype, that this thing could likely kill a T-Rex, which, how do you say that?
Yeah.
That's just not bold. A good scientific claim to make at all, because it's, who would win in a fight, Batman or Superman? But also I'm I really doubt that. This thing, it's big, but 18 feet long is not that big of an animal. It's really big compared to a person.
And I don't think you could even physically get them on the same planet to fight.
Oh no. But yeah, some of the other pieces about its anatomy are interesting though. It has these weird cheeks that sort of flip up. Almost like if you've seen the car doors that open up instead of out, they sort of flip up like that to make it so the teeth can fully sink into whatever it bites into, supposedly. But it also has these interesting quills around its neck that it pops up before it attacks. And unlike the bad reasons that they gave in Jurassic Park for the Dilophosaurus to have the frill thing, the reasons that it hypothesized for this actually kind of make sense. It's that it's some kind of sensory thing to even I think a couple of things like suggested maybe like echolocation a little bit,
Well,
to be able to make sure that it actually hits its target when it pounces or whatever.
that would be pretty cool.
Yeah. The field guide that I read also says that it's fairly closely related to the viper wolves, which are the smaller dog-like ones that Neytiri saves Jake from at the beginning of the movie. We're not really going to talk about them because they're very similar to this, but more dog-like and smaller.
Yeah.
But yeah, so interesting that they also make those inferences about relatedness in this official media. The next one we're going to talk about is another really well-designed one that they call the Hammerhead Titanothere. This is a really big rhino or elephant-like animal, but at the front of its head, it has a big like hammerhead sort of thing that comes out to either side of it.
This one was my favorite one.
I really like the design for this one. It's super cool. Unlike hammerheads, so hammerhead sharks have their eyes at the end of either of the long sideways bits. This one doesn't. So its eyes are sort of below those in the quote unquote normal place. But other than that, it basically uses the hammers to like knock down trees and stuff and to fight each other. So the name that they gave to this was Titanotherus hammercephalus, which again is just not a good name.
Yeah.
And
isn't cephalus like?
It means
skull,
head.
Brain. Yeah.
Yes.
Head.
Yeah. And so titanotheres are an actual group of extinct animals related to horses. They look a lot like rhinos. If you've seen Ice Age, what the two rhino-looking guys are, are likely the naming on them has kind of changed. Nowadays they're called brontotheres, but in the past they've been called titanotheres. So that is an actual group of life here, which, you know, to the movie's credit, they do look a lot like. But so when I read the name of that they gave to these things, I was like, okay, how much money did you spend on this movie?
Yeah.
And it turns out the answer is $237 million.
Holy crap!
I'm like, you couldn't pay a biologist like. Well, I guess another biologist, because I'm sure that they had lots of biologists that they consulted, but you couldn't find a taxonomist to be like, hey, come up with a good name that isn't just copy paste into Google Translate Latin, you know? So
we are suckers for Latin, though.
Oh, we sure are. So this one is around 36 feet long, around 20 feet tall, which makes it marginally bigger than the very largest elephant relatives. They could get to around 17-ish feet tall, like at the shoulder. So these were bigger than those, but not like gigantically bigger. Like sauropod dinosaurs were very comfortably larger than this.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because they make it seem like it's this giant thing in the movie, which like it is, don't get me wrong. But Earth has some pretty cool stuff too. So these things have some really thick skin and like bone armor covering their head on the hammer parts and around their neck and shoulders. Like I said, they have that really wide hammer part at the front of their head, which they even in the field guide said that when they're young, it's squishy and made out of cartilage instead of bone. Ooh. And it hardens when they get older.
That's cool. Is that like similar to hammerhead sharks?
So because they're sharks, it's always cartilage.
Well, yeah, that's true. Duh.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. And although it's never used, they apparently do also have the cues, the brain link things. We never see them get used in the movie, but apparently they do have them. Also, something I forgot to say is that the Thanator also has that, and that's actually used in the movie, which is pretty cool. That was a good scene. And they also, really cool, have a bright display behind their head that they can pop up when they're threatened by predators or when they're trying to scare off another of their species.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was really cool design. I really liked the way this thing looked.
Me too.
And they sort of also behaved more or less like a somewhat more social rhino, where they're just like a rhino but in herds. I guess that would pretty much just be an elephant then. Because I think they even said like the males generally are kind of solo, which is the case in elephants. But the females and the young kind of hang out in a group. So
cool.
Now we get into what I think is the only like actually domesticated animal we see in the movie, which they call the dire horse.
Yeah.
So these are called Equidyrus hoplites, which again is, that's okay. That one's not as bad as Titanotheris hammercephalus, but sure. And this is only marginally bigger than like Clydesdale horses. Yeah, it's about a third bigger, but compared to, the Navi being almost twice the size of a person, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So it's more or less just a horse, but with 6 legs and a subtle pair of extra eyes. They have extra air intake holes on their neck. Some of the other species, we pretty much only see 1 or 2. I think these look like they have like 4 on each side.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I saw said maybe that was an adaptation for being able to run longer, being able to get more air in. And I'm like, that's neat. I like that because that's kind of what horses are evolved to do here.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But the thing that I really liked about these is that they gave them a little bit more to their ecology because they are pollinators.
Oh, I remember this now.
Yeah, what we see them eat in the movie is they have this long tongue that they use to scoop sap out of like pitcher plants. And while they drink the sap, they like go from plant to plant and it pollinates them, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see like something like really big be a pollinator, because like the first thing that comes to mind are just insects to me.
Right. I think the biggest thing that I would really call a pollinator are some of the fruit bats.
Yeah.
And I guess the biggest like non-flying thing would be like maybe a couple species of like mice do some kind of pollination or some kind of rodent thing. But definitely not a horse.
Yeah.
And it has movable cues. Again, I'm going to keep saying the mind link thing. So it moves them, has one on each side of its head, and unlike the Navi, who have braided hair around them, these are, I think they mostly are used as like reins for when someone is riding these things, but they can move them around. And in the movie, it shows them almost using them to like move the plants toward their face so they don't have to move, which I thought was really fun. And unlike some of the other species, any individual Navi can sort of link with one of these horses and ride them around and do whatever. That's not necessarily the case with some of the other species that the Navi use. But so that's why they're sort of the most domesticated species that we see, which is also cool because we don't really see them doing a lot of the civilization-y type things that we think of with, early humans. I think they do a little bit of like farming. But for the most part, their culture is like hunter-gatherer type. And I also thought it was interesting that they didn't try to come up with some kind of dog analog in the movie to have them like domesticated dogs, because that's what the first animal that we domesticated. So, yes.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they have those other like little dog-like things that are like the Thanatos, but they aren't domesticated. So I guess,
Right. Yeah. So the other species that we see the Navi use a lot with their mind link are called Banshees. In the native Navi, and obviously there's Navi words for all of these different animals, but fun fact, there is an actual pterosaur named after these that was named in 2020.
Really?
Yeah. So the scientists named it Ikron Draco Avatar. That is an actual scientific name. The Navi name for these things is Ikron. So they just sort of took that, added Draco because, sure, and then Avatar as the species name. So, fun fact.
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I like that much better than the scientific name that the creative people working for James Cameron gave these things, because they gave it the genus Pterodactylus, which is an actual genus. That's like where the actual name pterodactyl came from, is the genus Pterodactylus. So this is Pterodactylus giganteus. So same boat as using Homo as the genus for the Navi. Not really a fan, but
I have to feel slightly partial towards these names because I feel like with the breast situation too, like the movie was also trying to be relatable. And so although these names technically are incorrect, they are at least trying to be relatable to the species.
I would agree with you if they actually say any of these in the movie.
True. So
they don't.
Where do these names come from? Like, how did you get this information?
Most of them is from that field guide book that I mentioned. I think specifically this one was mentioned in an interview because this one did not have a scientific name in the field guide. Almost all the other ones did, but this one did not. So I definitely saw this cited in a couple places from, I think, an interview that James Cameron did.
Gotcha.
Yeah. However, that doesn't mean that they're any less cool. I think that this one and its big brother are the coolest animals in the movie, personally. So these, the smaller ones, have a wingspan of around 45 feet, which is already comfortably bigger than even the biggest pterosaurs.
Yeah. What would, like, the biggest pterosaurs, what's their range?
Somewhere in the ballpark of 35. If you said 40, nobody would really question you. But yeah, 45 is maybe at certain points in paleontology people have been like that maybe that was an estimate at some point, but the current thinking is no, they didn't get that big. Like I said, these are the smaller ones. And these are also the only other animal that we see that doesn't have 6 limbs. This one only has 4. So all 4 of them are turned into wings, while still having somewhat functional feet as well, which is interesting because they make them like quadrupedal on the ground like a pterosaur, but they structure the hands more like bats. So as with bats, they have the wing and then they just have their thumb free to cling on to stuff with, whereas pterosaurs, their wing was just one finger and then they had the rest of their hand to walk around with.
Did you find anything in your digging about why they would have 4 limbs compared to all the other creatures?
Nope.
Okay, just 'cause.
Yeah, pretty much. Which again is interesting because the one that it says is they're most closely related to is the next one we're going to talk about, but that also has 6 limbs and is much bigger. So my first thought was, well, birds did a lot of weird stuff and reduced and got rid of a lot of bones and things when they started flying, But I'm like, well, if the bigger one has it, I don't think these guys can use that as an excuse. So, yeah, no real reason given. I think even the field guide was like, we're not sure.
Okay.
So,
anyway.
Yeah. And so their wings are really interesting. So they have 3 sort of large lobes on the front wings that, as you get toward the end of them, they turn translucent and sort of rounded at the tips, and they look like dragonfly wings almost. And again, like I said, they have the single clawed digit sort of in the middle of the wing like a bat, and then a long membrane that goes from the wrist down to the waist, like in bats or in pterosaurs. And then the hind limbs are just sort of a fairly simple triangle membrane, also with a single clawed toe on it. They have these really cool, like, retractable teeth, which is really cool when they, like, hiss at stuff. At first, they open their mouth, and you don't really see any, and then they, like, hiss, and it shoots the teeth out, so they're pointy. It was really cool.
Yeah.
They have only a single breathing hole, but instead of being, like, on the neck, it's basically on the chest. And I didn't see this anywhere, but I was like, maybe that's, like, a more direct way to get air straight to the lungs.
Yeah.
So, like, a different way of being efficient than the horses. And, yeah, so these guys are some of the coolest ones, just because also we get the closest up sort of features of them. So just, more detail about stuff makes them more interesting.
Yeah.
But the big brother is probably my favorite out of all of them. So the Navi call it Turok, but the scientific name is Leonopteryx Rex, which is that one's a pretty decent name actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so it means.
But Rex.
Well, yes. Rex means king, but Leonopteryx means lion wing or ruling wing. So
cool.
this, yeah. So depending on what source I looked at, it said the wingspan could have been around 80 feet, but other individuals could be over 100 feet.
Wow.
Which again, comfortably, more than double the size of the wingspan of the biggest things that ever flew on Earth.
Yeah.
So it is bright orangish red with black stripes and then a big blue crest on the top and bottom of its skull. Like I said, everything said it's somewhat closely related to the Banshees, but this one still has 6 limbs. It has the main front pair that are the big wings that are very similar to what I said for the Banshees. The smaller pair of wings, which again is pretty similar, and then they have a last pair of big old legs for taking off and grabbing stuff. And the more I actually thought about it, I'm like, could something that big actually fly? And the answer is, on Earth, no. No.
Right.
Not close. But then I actually thought a little bit more about the physics, which is why I mentioned the physics earlier. So the gravity on Pandora is lower than on Earth. The planet is smaller, so it has less gravity.
Okay.
There were actual numbers given, but I don't remember what they were. It was somewhere in the ballpark of like 80% of Earth's gravity, so not too much. More than the moon, for example.
Yeah.
But so because the gravity is lower, it would have a relatively easier time getting off the ground. Because the atmosphere is thicker, like just more dense, that would actually give it more lift due to physics reasons that I don't want to go into. I don't want to just say, trust me, bro, but trust me, bro. So once it's in the air, totally plausible. It could absolutely do fine. Where it loses me is how it takes off. So in episode 29, we talked about pterosaurs and how a potential reason that they were able to get so much bigger than the biggest flying birds. So like I said, for example, the biggest flying pterosaurs had a wingspan of somewhere in the ballpark of 35 to 40 feet. The largest wingspan of a bird is 20 to maybe like 22, 23. So considerably smaller.
Yeah.
But the reason that pterosaurs might have been able to get so much bigger is because they use their arms to take off instead of their legs. If you watch a bird take off, it like jumps and then starts flapping.
Yeah.
But with pterosaurs, they more or less just did a big push-up. And the benefit to doing that is the push-up muscles are the same as the flying muscles. And so, unlike with birds, once a bird is in the air, those big, beefy legs that you have to use to take off are now just dead weight. So they don't help you at all once you're in the air, whereas your big, beefy pushing up muscles now do. And so it's just a much more efficient way of getting into the air. However, we see this guy taking off with its legs just like a bird. So I think it would have been cool if they had it do the mega push-ups that we are pretty sure pterosaurs did. Although I don't know if we knew that at the time. I think that's a fairly new way of thinking about pterosaurs. So I don't know. Okay. You might get a pass on that one, James Cameron.
Give him a break.
Yeah. So that is all the animals that we're going to talk about. But I have a couple concepts that I want to talk about. The first one is convergent evolution. And so convergent evolution here on Earth is when two groups of animals evolve a similar feature independently. So for example, birds and bats both evolved wings completely separately. They both evolved them from non-winged ancestors. And so that is a convergent feature. Obviously, because a lot of these animals on Pandora are based on Earth animals, there's a lot of convergent things. Like I said, the Thanator is extremely convergent with panthers. The hammerheads are very convergent on things like rhinos. And both Toruk and the Banshees are very convergent on pterosaurs. And I asked myself, like, would these animals really look that similar to Earth's animals? And the answer is maybe. Yeah, but there was a paper in the journal Trends in Evolution and Ecology. So like a decently well-known, journal about
if I know it, then I feel like it's gotta be
right. Yeah. And so some of the authors that wrote that little paper quoted Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the most influential paleontologists of the entire 1900s. He wrote a book, and in that book, he basically said, if you were to rerun the tape on life, if you were to just rewind it all and push play again, you would not get the same results to what we have today. And I don't think I agree with that necessarily. Really? Like, would you get the exact same things in the same order that they happened in? No, for sure not. But the rules of the universe still apply, if that makes sense. So there will always be like an optimal shape or function or behavior for an animal to do any task. And evolution will sort of select toward that. Now, evolution doesn't have an end goal in mind, like that sort of makes it sound. But if there's a more efficient way to do something, odds are evolution will get there.
Yeah. I thought I agreed with it, but you are kind of making some sense here.
Right. So it's like, say, for example, bivalves, if, some, this population of oysters can move more water through itself per minute. That means it can filter more food, and it has a more efficient mechanism for doing a thing that it does. If that's beneficial, that will get selected for it, and so on and so forth. And granted, like I said, things will not look the same. Evolution would not play out in the same way, but you'd see a lot of very similar patterns. And that's kind of what we see on Pandora, more or less. That's a really cop-out way of doing it. By being like, yeah, we definitely didn't just take the body of a rhino and click the corner and drag it up to make it bigger. But I definitely, that's sort of what that paper in that journal was arguing was, no, this isn't improbable that it would be this similar. So that's one of the concepts that I wanted to touch on. The other one is that I saw come up a number of times in various things that I read about it, and that is a concept called panspermia, which is it is the hypothesis that life did not evolve on Earth, that life got to Earth from space.
Okay.
So that has been a very long-running hypothesis. That is definitely not a new thing come up around this movie. And more modern interpretations would say that this is much more like accidental, that like life rode here on a meteor or something and, you know, just happened to be a decent spot for life to not die instantly. And some take it even a little less drastic than that. That like some of the building blocks of life rode here on meteors and then were assembled here, which is definitely something that I could get more behind than life, you know, riding comets around the universe. But older interpretations suggest that an intelligent spacefaring species planted life among the universe.
Aliens.
Yeah. And even, this was something that really blew my mind from this little paper, even Francis Crick, a very well-known biologist who was one of the people who discovered the structure of DNA. You know, if you've ever taken a biology class and heard of Watson and Crick, this was Crick. And in 1973, he published a paper suggesting that could have been the case, that an intelligent spacefaring civilization planted seeds around the universe, and that led to life on Earth. I have much less respect for Francis Crick now. Even after what he did to Rosalind Franklin, with not giving her the credit she deserves for the structure of DNA things. That's a whole other thing. But anyway, the big problem with panspermia is that it is an untestable hypothesis.
Yep.
Like there's no way to falsify that. So that's just not good science. It's interesting to think about and talk about, but it's not like the whole point of doing science is to test hypotheses. And that's just a hypothesis that we will never be able to test. And it's also a big cop out. It's like, oh, we don't need to explain how life, arrived on Earth, how it grew from the muck of nothing, because it didn't. It rode here on a comet. However, that would explain why life on Earth and Pandora both have DNA, because the odds of both of them naturally coming upon DNA as their mode of reproductive, heritability, is astronomical. DNA is an incredibly complex molecule, and that's something that I probably wouldn't buy, that they both came upon DNA independently. So I guess in this Avatar universe, panspermia is a thing in some form or another.
Okay. Well, very cool. Thank you for that interesting concept.
Yeah. And so that's pretty much all I've got to talk about with the world of Avatar. I could literally go on about this for another probably 2 or 3 hours if you let me, but that's not interesting content. So,
Gavin, you had asked me to research some of the animals before the episode, and I was like, well, I don't know how many to research, so I just said all of them. And so I was expecting all these little like crab creatures and these bugs and everything, but you hit the big ones, and that was pretty cool.
Right. And like my original plan was to go through at least 3 or 4 more, and also a couple of plants, because some of the plants do some weird stuff. But I was like, oh, we're already at 4 pages of notes. I can't do more.
Yeah.
So, like I said, if you want a Pandora encore, maybe including some invertebrates next time, definitely let us know in all of our ways that we talked about earlier to give us some feedback. So thank you all so much for listening and nerding out about this with me. Like I said, up there with my favorite movies of all time. And I'm glad that I get to talk about it and nerd out about it with some friends. So thank you all for listening. This has been episode 88 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, that is Fia, and we will see you all next week. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.